What I'm starting to feel like is a vibe shift about AI. How good can these tools actually get? What does it look like for a motion designer trying to make a living in this industry? Let's talk about AI. It is by far the most popular topic that we get asked about at School of Motion. And for obvious reasons, we've been very focused on it and trying to examine it as objectively as we can so that we can really be able to inform our audience about the actual practical utility of it, what we're expecting to happen in the near term and the long-term future, and how we think it's actually going to impact motion designers. So today, I wanted to talk about a few areas. One, I wanted to talk about the fact that we are potentially, very likely, in an AI bubble. And what does that mean for us? I also want to talk about what I'm starting to feel like is a vibe shift about AI. It's a little bit more acceptable now for artists to start using these tools. And what does that mean for motion design? I want to talk about some practical current uses for AI that are actually usable right now and will probably just get better in the coming years. I'm going to be talking about real companies, real numbers, but I'm also going to be speculating. And the goal here is really just to continue the conversation and hopefully encourage some artists to start experimenting with these tools if they haven't already. And I would love it if you left a comment after you listen to this. Let me know what you think about this. All right, here we go. So let's start by talking about the fact that many people, not just me, but a lot of really smart people, investors, founders, technical people, believe that we are in an AI bubble right now. Just in case you don't really know what a bubble is in economic terms, it really means a situation where you have a new technology or a new company, something new, and there is so much hype around it that it sort of fools everybody. And tons and tons and tons of money gets pumped into this new technology or this new field, but the money that's being pumped in doesn't actually reflect the true value of what's being produced. And so you'll end up with companies worth hundreds of millions or billions of dollars, or you'll have everyone and their mother trying to start a company based on this new thing. And in the end, a lot of those will fail when eventually the world comes to its senses and realizes this is not actually as useful as we were led to believe. A really famous example of a bubble was the dot-com bubble, which burst in the very early 2000s. Now, I know some of you watching this were probably really young during that point or maybe missed it entirely. So I'll give you the brief history of it. In the late 90s, the internet started to become a thing that more and more people used. And it started with companies like America Online and Prodigy and CompuServe, where they weren't really the open internet. These companies weren't providing you access to the World Wide Web. They were sort of these walled gardens, but they were sort of a precursor to the World Wide Web. Then all of a sudden, the World Wide Web becomes accessible. And I was a young kid. I was probably 11 or 12 in those days. And the only way you could connect to the World Wide Web was through some other service. And you had to use a modem, which if you don't know what that is, it's literally a device you'd hook up to your computer. And then you'd hook it up to your phone line and it would make sounds like these weird clicks and beeps. It's really kind of something you can't forget once you've heard it. And using audio, it would talk to other modems across the globe, and that is how you communicated. And it worked, but it was incredibly slow. So the World Wide Web wasn't adopted very quickly. It took a few years. Once broadband started to become more prevalent and more people had access to high-speed internet, all of a sudden the World Wide Web took off, and it took off very, very quickly. So at that time, everyone was just trying to figure out how the internet could be used. And there are some companies from that era that are still around. Amazon is one of the most famous ones. But once investors and technologists realized how cool this was and all of the different things it opened up for everybody, money just got dumped into it hand over fist. And there was this time period of a few years where you could start a company that sold anything, and you could add .com to the end of the name of your company, and investors would throw money at you. One of the most famous examples of a company that imploded during this bubble was pets.com, which was sort of like Amazon, but they would sell you pet food over the internet. And this was in the very early days. It was still pretty tricky to actually accept payments and to even use a credit card on the internet was seen as very, very risky. And the problem with the company was that the only way that they were able to compete with, say, PetSmart and all these other companies that you would just drive to buy your dog food was to try and price the dog food about as expensive or a little bit cheaper so that there was some incentive for people to take a risk and put their credit card into a website, which again was seen as very risky, and order dog food. So what that means is their profit margins were very, very thin. So every bag of, 40 pounds of dog food they sold, they would only make $1 or something like that. Like not very much money. And that may sound crazy, but that's actually the way a lot of companies start off, barely profitable, and a lot of venture capital backed companies start off as unprofitable. Famously, Amazon never made a profit for the first 9 years of its existence, and even Uber was unprofitable for the first 15 years. I think this year or last year was literally the first year they ever made a profit in a year. So Pets.com and lots of other companies like them were just sort of hoping that this bubble would never pop, because eventually if enough people started buying, they would make up for their tiny, tiny profit margins with quantity, and they'd be able to build a sustainable business. And in those days, for them to get a customer, they had to spend a ton of money on marketing. They did Super Bowl ads. They had this whole ad campaign with a little sock puppet dog. It was actually pretty cute, but it made for an unsustainable business. So even though early adopters thought it was amazing that they didn't have to drive to the store to get dog food, the business could not last. And eventually it imploded when the dot-com bubble burst. When the bubble popped, the NASDAQ, which is a stock exchange that primarily holds tech stocks, it dropped by 78%. It was probably one of the worst stock market crashes in history. And I remember going through that. I was pretty young, but I remember watching my father and watching the blood drain out of his face as his 401k was cut, more than in half. And so what does this have to do with AI? So I think there are actually some similarities between what happened in the early 2000s and what's happening now. Now, to jump ahead for a minute, lots of companies went completely bankrupt and just didn't exist anymore when the bubble popped. However, the ones that actually were focused on building something sustainable long-term, like Amazon, are still around and are now some of the biggest companies in the world. You can think of Yahoo, which is still around, but is much, much smaller than it was at one point. But Google was founded a few years after that, Facebook. So some of these companies that use that strategy of being unprofitable or barely profitable for a long time ended up figuring out how to become extraordinarily profitable. But that's rare. The air is very thin up there. Now, that bubble was a long time ago. So let's talk about a more recent one that I'm sure everybody watching this will be familiar with, which is the Web3 bubble. You remember that one, right? Like right around the time COVID started to be a thing, everybody was into crypto and NFTs and blockchain, and all of the investor money was being pumped into these companies. And it was very, very similar. A lot of people wrote about it at the time, that you could take a normal company, like a company that's making a video game or something like that, and you could just say Web3 enabled or on the blockchain or something like that, and you would just get money thrown at you from investors to build on that because there was all this hype around it. And it's really hard to remember in hindsight because now I think everybody feels very differently about that technology. But at the time, very, very smart people were saying that this is going to revolutionize everything. And in just a few years, every company is going to have its own blockchain or be part of maybe Ethereum's blockchain. And there's going to be all of this incentive to actually pay your customers through crypto and tokens and all this kind of stuff. And everybody believed it. And so much money was incinerated when that bubble popped. And if you look at the current state of the blockchain or Web3, you've got a few use cases that are still doing fairly well. Bitcoin, Ethereum is doing fairly well. It just had a major dip recently, but it's still functioning. It's still doing well. But a lot of the projects that were started are almost gone, or at the very least, just barely scraping by, probably surviving on the investor money that they raised during those years. But it's just a matter of time before a lot of them just shut down and go away. Now, in both cases, in the dot-com bubble and the Web3 bubble, the technology that sort of sparked the hype is still around, and there are still huge businesses using it. So the problem isn't the technology itself. Obviously, the internet was a successful technology, and it's probably the case that blockchain is going to be a very successful technology. The problem is the hype around them just vastly overstated the real utility of them. And not just the utility, but actually the state of the art that they were in at the time. When the dot-com bubble was happening, most people did not have broadband internet access. So a lot of the use cases, putting video on the internet or having social networks that required, lots of data to be downloaded to your computer to display things, they weren't really fun to use. It was really a painful, slow process. And with Web3, a lot of the technology is clunky. There's been so many examples of theft and rug pulls and just outright fraud with it. And so there aren't quite the guardrails and the software yet to make it easy for the average person to use. Now, in 20 or 30 years, that will probably not be the case. But the bubble of Web3 popped and people are now skeptical about it. And so it's just going to take decades for it to actually play out. So bubbles, I think a lot of times they're really about that initial hype cycle that happens when there's a new thing. And then you have to look way down the road to try and predict how this will actually be useful to you. And you can try your best. It's very hard to not get caught up in the hype. Now, one thing that is kind of interesting to consider is how government economic policy actually affects this. The Federal Reserve of the United States sets our interest rates for essentially how much money the United States is going to pay someone who takes on debt from the US. And this profoundly impacts the investing landscape because when you have pension funds and you've got these very rich people that want to make money with their money, well, when the interest rate is 5.5%, which is about what it is right now, it's the highest it's been in 22 years, that's seen currently as a very safe investment. You're going to make 5.5% on your money. But for years, the Fed's policy was to have a 0% interest rate, meaning that there was no perfectly safe investment you could make. And so you had to take on risk. And so that really helps spur the growth of venture capital. Venture capital firms just get money from investors and they deploy that money to startups and try to start companies. And their goal is to grow a company so big that it can 10x their money and sometimes even 100x their money. That definitely happens. And in the meantime, all of the companies they've invested in that don't look like they're going to 10x the investor's money, they just try to get them to grow at all costs. They don't worry about profit. They want them to get really, really big so that they can raise more money and get even bigger and raise more money and get even bigger and eventually go public or get acquired by a larger company. And that's how investors make their money back. And when the interest rate is set to 0, that's a very enticing proposition. But now the interest rate is not 0. And the effect of this is that right now, and for sure in the future, if interest rates stay where they are, it's going to be much harder for companies to raise the large sums of money that they're used to raising. And so that means that startups right now have to be focused on creating businesses that at least in a few years can be profitable. Not definitely will be profitable because you can't guarantee that. But at least if you pencil out the math, there has to be some route to become profitable, or else you're kind of doomed because it's not clear that a company is going to be able to go out and raise another $50, $100 million. All right, so now let's talk about AI. What does this all have to do with AI? AI is an exorbitantly expensive technology. And this may not be obvious because currently most of the tools we use are actually really inexpensive. You can use ChatGPT for free. And if you want to use the best model and have, sort of an unlimited amount of use, then you can pay $20 a month. Or if you have a business account like School of Motion has, it's $30 a month per person. That's insanely cheap. At that price point, it's like a no-brainer. If you get any utility out of it as a business, that is one of the cheapest bills you're going to have. And we actually get a ton of use out of large language models like ChatGPT. We also use Claude, which was built by Anthropic. And that's also something like $20 or $30 a month. They're very, very cheap and they're so useful. The question is, can those companies actually survive charging people $20 or $30 a month? So here's some interesting numbers. So for ChatGPT 3, which was sort of an order of magnitude less capable than GPT-4, which is the current state of the art, it was reported that OpenAI has to spend $700,000 a day to run that model. Now, ChatGPT-4 is far larger. It takes far more compute and energy to run. OpenAI is definitely spending millions of dollars per day just to run these models. And you might think, well, that's fine because they've got millions of customers. They also have a big staff. They have a lot of payroll. There's lawsuits going on. And so while they're estimated to generate $3.5 billion of revenue this year, they're estimated to lose $5 billion this year, a $5 billion loss. This is the most high-tech AI company on earth right now, and they are going to lose $5 billion this year. Now that might seem insane to you. It does seem insane, right? That's clearly insane. However, that's not without precedent. Companies have operated at a loss for years, knowing that they can raise more investor money to keep going. And as long as they get to a certain size, there will be an option to cut costs, raise prices, do something like that to become profitable. But when you're losing $5 billion in 1 year, it is questionable. I think it's a fair question. Can OpenAI, one of the top companies in this field, actually get profitable? They can't lose money forever. No company can. Now, not every company is losing money. Most of the big ones are, but one weird outlier is Midjourney. Midjourney is actually profitable according to their founder. This is really interesting to me. They didn't take any investor money. They did what's called bootstrapping, meaning the founders invested their own money to get it started, and then they tried to get profitable as quickly as they could so that the profits could be reinvested to grow the company, and that's what they've done. But Midjourney has a very, very narrow niche that it's targeting right now. It'll be very interesting to see if they can maintain that profitability once they start opening up their model for video generation, which is far more expensive. So this is where we begin to talk about why people think we might be inside of an AI bubble right now. There is obviously an absurd amount of hype around AI, and I think that's for good reason. It really is probably the most transformative technology that I've seen in my lifetime. The capabilities are crazy. You've all seen the crazy videos that look like they were shot with a camera, but they weren't. AI generated them. It's wild. And that's great. And I think it's a testament to human ingenuity. However, at the end of the day, you have to make a profitable business based on that. And the current generation of AI models have a lot of issues. It takes an absolutely obscene amount of data to train a model like ChatGPT-4. For ChatGPT-5, which is rumored to come out later this year, there's got to be something like 10 times the amount of data that was used to train ChatGPT-4. And the amount of data isn't the only variable that dictates the effectiveness of a model. There's also training and weighting, and there's a whole bunch of other technologies involved. However, you have to spend so much more money to get to that next level. And it's at the point where, $100 billion a year is being spent on this stuff, and very few companies are actually profitable. And even the ones that are, it remains to be seen as they scale if they can maintain that. So it's quite possible that these AI companies just kind of run out of investors to keep pumping money into them. Remember, the interest rate is not 0 anymore. It's about 5.5% right now. And so investors have other safe bets they can make. Investors don't invest in AI from the goodness of their hearts. They do it because they want to make money. And if it turns out that the technology is unbelievable, it's amazing, but it's like having a rocket ship. It's just too expensive for that many customers to exist. And the other thing to consider is how useful are these tools actually. They're amazing, and you can do some really cool stuff with them. And personally, I think they're actually very useful. But they're useful for narrow use cases. They're not useful universally, which is kind of what the promise of AI is. And so what happens if OpenAI, it turns out, can't actually release something much better than GPT-4 where people are willing to pay more for it? What if it turns out that ChatGPT-4, which is really, really cool, but still hallucinates, and hallucinate in this context just means it makes things up that aren't true, but it's very convincing. What happens if that problem sticks around for too long and they keep burning billions of dollars every year? And what happens if in a couple of years they just can't justify running at a loss anymore? What are these companies going to do? Well, there's really only two options. Option one is you go out of business. And I do think a lot of these companies are going to go out of business when the bubble eventually does pop. I think we are going to have less AI options, and it's going to be the companies that have really focused on being efficient, lean, and profitable from the start. I think they have a better chance of surviving. But the other thing that companies can do is they can change the math. And part of me predicts that this is actually going to happen. So this is where you have to judge how useful these things really are to you. If ChatGPT-4, which is currently $20 a month for an individual to go buy an account, what if that was $200 a month? If it cost 10 times as much, that might let OpenAI be sustainable and be successful. But would you pay that, or would you just go back to not using it? Same thing with Midjourney. If Midjourney, which is currently $30 for the standard plan per month and $60 for the pro plan, and if you use it about the amount that we do, we're on the standard plan, would you pay 10 times that to use Midjourney? Is it that valuable? Would you pay $300 a month, $3,600 a year per seat? to use that tool. So I think that if AI companies had to raise their prices to actually make a profit based on their revenue going up from raising prices, I think they would lose a ton of customers because, at least for now, these tools are useful-ish. And I've talked about it a lot on this channel, but they're not so useful that you'd be willing to fork over thousands and thousands of dollars a year yet. Maybe they get there, but there's kind of a race on. If they can get there before they run out of money and run out of investors to pump more into them, maybe it's all going to be fine, but this definitely feels a little bubbly to me. Another thing that AI companies can do, I'm not sure it would work, is just try to keep growing and acquire more customers. A lot of companies have some sort of steady state number of customers, sort of a revenue benchmark they have to hit just to be profitable. And then after that, if they keep growing, then their profit grows. The problem with AI is that it doesn't work the same way, say, a software company works. If you run a software company, then there's some amount of licenses you have to sell each year to pay your bills. And after that, you're making profit because the marginal cost of selling one more software license to someone is pretty close to zero. Software is essentially free to transfer over the internet. It then runs on someone's computer and it doesn't cost the company more, maybe a little bit more in extra support or something like that. But there's not really a very big cost associated with selling 100 more licenses of software. However, with AI, because it's so compute and energy intensive to run these models, that's not true. Every time you log into ChatGPT or Midjourney and you type in a prompt, there is a computer or many computers somewhere in the world spinning up GPUs and sucking up a ton of energy to give you that generation. In the case of ChatGPT, every time you prompt it, they are losing money on you. And the problem is it's not clear that that problem goes away with more customers. The problem could get worse for all we know. And then there's maybe some other clever ways that companies could avoid being destroyed by the bubble popping. Things like forming partnerships with really large companies like Google and Microsoft and Amazon, which of course OpenAI has a partnership with Microsoft. Anthropic has a partnership with Amazon. And these companies are so big and have so much cash that they can fund these things for years and years and years and let them use their compute as part of the deal. But not every company is going to have that opportunity. And even companies like Amazon and Microsoft don't want to burn billions of dollars and just light it on fire every year. So eventually, even that isn't going to work. So these are all the reasons why a lot of people think we might be in a bubble. These models are just so expensive to run, and it's not clear how to turn these companies into profitable companies in any short amount of time. And because of the investment environment we're in, it's not as easy to keep raising money. And I watch a lot of podcasts and I read a lot of newsletters, and it seems like investors are definitely souring on AI a little bit. It hasn't lived up to the hype yet in the way that people like Sam Altman have been telling us. So in a little bit, I'll talk about what I think this actually means for motion designers and how AI intersects with our industry and what might happen if the bubble popped. But next, I want to talk about something that I've been sort of feeling for the past couple of months, really, and that is this vibe shift. Now, for the purposes of this conversation, I'm not going to go too deep into the ethical concerns around these tools. Those are very valid, and I think that's just a bigger conversation. What I want to focus on is the practical right now, because the ethical stuff is going to be litigated and there's probably going to be regulation around it eventually. And some companies already have rules about how you're able to use generative AI when you're working with them. But I think the ethical considerations triggered the initial backlash against these tools. If you remember, 2.5 years ago, when we started seeing the initial output from Midjourney and DALL-E, those were the two tools that really first caught my eye. There was an almost immediate backlash against them from professional artists and other creatives. And there were kind of two lines of attack here. One was, this is soulless, it's going to put artists out of work, and it's just kind of immoral to do that. And the other line of attack was that the way these tools were built was by scraping and training on copyrighted artwork that artists did not give the companies permission to use. And they certainly didn't pay those artists, which they almost certainly should have done. And so in those early days, it was a little scary to even post that you were experimenting with these tools because you might get attacked by other artists. There still is a backlash against these tools, but it's quieted down quite a bit. And the way I've noticed it is just that I hear less criticism of AI tools as far as like you shouldn't use them, they're unethical. Those arguments still exist for sure, and I think there's validity to them. However, mostly what I hear now is that these tools aren't good or they're not good enough. And I think it's really interesting that the conversation seems to be slowly shifting in that direction. And that direction I actually kind of believe. Now, don't get me wrong, I think these tools are insanely useful, but they're not useful enough yet. They're not as useful as the promise of AI tools. But they're useful enough where studios are starting to use them in their pipeline. And I think more and more artists, even if they're not talking about it publicly, are starting to use them as well. And the brave artists out there that are using them and then actually publicly saying that they're using them are not getting dogpiled quite the same way that they were a couple of years ago. So it seems like AI is slowly becoming acceptable to use in the creative world. Now, why is this? I have a couple theories. One, I think that it's just human nature. When there's something new and you don't really understand it and you don't really know how quickly it's going to develop, it's scary. And I think when we tweet from a place of fear, we tend to tweet in anger, is maybe a good way of putting it. And these tools have now been around long enough where I think some of that initial hot-headedness is kind of dissipated and people are just more accepting. This is here. It's not going away. People are using it. And I might as well make peace with it. So I think that's kind of one sentiment. But there's another one, and this is the interesting one to me. I think artists are starting to realize that these tools are not the threat that we thought they were. Now, don't get me wrong. I think if you're a stock photographer, these tools really can be a threat to your livelihood if the only way you make money is going out and taking photos and putting them on stock websites to get a commission. I think that business model is going to be a lot harder to do in the future. It may already be basically over. And I think initially creatives may have thought that, well, a photographer and a motion designer, they do very different things, but they're both professional artists creating artwork for clients, right? But I think there's enough differences. The devil's always in the details, right? So I think if you're a photographer and you're taking stock photos of a location, a really cool temple in India or something, then your ability to make money is going to be reliant on your ability to capture unique photos that can help someone else tell a story. An AI tool like Midjourney or Flux, these tools have gotten so good now that you can get a lot more flexibility with your imagery by using them. But if you're doing some abstract graphic design or motion design, the technical barriers and the creative barriers and the specs that you need to hit for your client, they are so much more precise than stock photography. So it's just 90% more technically difficult. And that's kind of a moat. These AI tools are not there yet, and they are starting to plateau in some areas. And so my gut is that a lot of artists are starting to wake up to the fact that these tools can be useful, but they cannot replace artists. Certainly not now. And frankly, I don't think they can ever really replace artists. And I'll talk about that in a little bit too. So you've just got more familiarity with AI tools. You've got the realization that they're not going away and there's kind of acceptance, right? It's one of the stages of grief. And you've got the realization that these tools are not nearly as disruptive to our industry as we initially thought they might be. If you've ever tried to actually implement AI imagery into your motion design, you know that it can save you time, but it's not going to do the work for you. You're still going to have to do an absurd amount of work, just like you have to do on every single motion design project to make the imagery usable, to clean up the hallucinations, all those things. So the net effect of this that I'm seeing is more and more people are comfortable confessing that they're using these AI tools. I'm also hearing about a lot of studios that are starting to work AI into their pipeline in some really, really interesting ways. Now, not many of them have talked publicly about this yet, so I don't want to say any names, but some really well-known studios are currently using AI to help them with really tedious tasks, help them generate more ideas, help them generate assets. There's a lot of ways that it can be really, really useful and save time. And one really cool thing about this vibe shift to me is that I'm seeing a ton of AI tools being created for motion designers and for post-production professionals. At School of Motion, we use DALL-E, we use Midjourney, but we also use other tools built on large language models. So there's an amazing tool that our editors use called Brevity. Brevity was created by Danny Perry and his team at Plug and Play, and it's an extension for Adobe Premiere that can transcribe your edit for you, which Premiere can already do built in, but Brevity, I believe, is using ChatGPT or Claude. It's using an API from one of the big large language model providers. So you get a really clean transcription, and then it can add those social social media captions instantly for you, which is really, really helpful for marketing. The other thing it can do though, which is really neat, is that it can scan your script and it can suggest B-roll shots for you. And it can even pull those B-roll shots in from places like Pexels. And I feel like if this tool came out a couple of years ago, there might have been some backlash about it. There seems to be less backlash around ChatGPT and Claude. It's more Midjourney and DALL-E and Runway and tools like that. But now this tool comes out and it's getting rave reviews. It's doing really well. It's legitimately helpful. And so I think the vibe shift sort of opens up opportunities like that. I went to AE Scripts recently and I saw a lot of AI enhanced tools and plugins for After Effects on there. Some of them are literally creating generative AI outputs inside of After Effects for you. And I don't hear a whole bunch of anger about this. I feel like people are starting to realize that maybe it's the term AI, artificial intelligence, because that's not really what these things are. They're machine learning models, but that's a different podcast. But it feels, and I'm really curious what you think, so leave a comment. It feels like the tide is turning a little bit and it's starting to become more okay as professional artists to use these tools in your work. And so now I want to talk about some of the current use cases for AI. And I think this will highlight just how useful they can be, but also it will highlight the limitations of them and why I really don't think anyone's going to be out of a job because of these tools anytime soon in motion design. My take on a tool like Midjourney right now is that it's essentially an amazing stock imagery generator. That's what it's good for. So here's an actual example. I was creating something for a course at School of Motion, and I needed a bunch of photos of rusty gears that I could kind of piece together and animate. And so what I would typically do is I would use our Adobe stock photo account. I'd get on there and I would search for photos of gears. Now, when you have something like, I need an oak tree, you're gonna find thousands of images. If you need a sailboat or if you need a guitar, you can find those things. But when you need an overhead shot with very little parallax and perspective of rusty gears on a background where you could fairly easily cut those out, well, that may not actually exist. And so before generative AI tools existed, how would I have gotten that image? Well, I'd probably have to go out and find an image of gears or maybe several images and kind of combine them. I'd have to bring them into Photoshop and probably do some texturing and stuff to make them look rusty. And then I'd have to cut them all out and use them. It's doable, but it would take a lot more work. Instead, what I did was I went on ChatGPT. I asked it to create a prompt that I could paste into Midjourney that would give me an overhead shot of a white background with several rusty gears, various shapes and sizes on it. A couple seconds later, it gives me the prompt. I paste it into Midjourney. I had to do 2 or 3 generations to get exactly what I wanted. It took about 5 minutes, and then I had what I wanted. But it didn't look quite right. So then what I did was I took the output and I fed it into Magnific, which is my favorite AI tool at the moment. It's an AI upscaler. It can also do style transfer. It can do a lot of really cool things. But when you upscale images with it, it just has this way of making them feel way more real. It adds more detail. It actually hallucinates more detail to create the extra resolution. And so at the end of the day, I had exactly the asset I needed. It was very easy to cut the gears out and use them, and they work perfectly. But notice that it still took a lot of work, and I still had to know a lot of things to be able to use the tool in that way. We use these tools a lot when we generate thumbnails for our YouTube videos too, because if Frank, our art director, or Aaron, who runs our marketing team, if they have a really clever idea for a visual pun or something that they want to see, sometimes you can find a stock photo for that. But, we're a pretty goofy company. Our sense of humor is kind of weird. And so a lot of times you can't find an image of a scuba diving pug or something like that. But you can generate it and you can run it through a bunch of filters, and then you can bring it into Photoshop and chop pieces out and change things and color correct it and add type on top and do design with that. And so really what you're doing is you're generating assets to use in your own work. And at least personally, I'm curious what you think, but personally, when I think of these tools as asset generators, just really good, efficient asset generators, they don't seem as nasty to me as this is going to replace graphic designers, which is what you will read if you get on X or sometimes on Instagram. That was kind of the sentiment during the initial hype cycle around all this stuff. But I think now, as we come close to the bubble bursting, people are realizing that's not what these things are. They're the best stock photo generators on Earth, and there are some very serious ethical concerns around them. However, in use for professional work, they're actually very useful. There's a lot of amazing use cases for large language models. Our Motion Mondays video, which comes out every Monday, would be almost impossible to do in the time frame that we have to get those out each week if we didn't have large language models to help us write those scripts. And to be clear, they don't actually write the script for us. What happens is we collect all of the news, and then I essentially do a monologue into my microphone for an hour or an hour and a half, just kind of rambling my thoughts about all these things. And then I feed that into Claude, which is kind of like ChatGPT. And I have a very detailed prompt that I've written out. It's very, very long. I put examples of old scripts in it, and it can then mimic my voice, take what I just fed into it and turn that into a script, which then I still have to go through and make sure it didn't hallucinate anything. It uses certain words too much. It says game changing in basically every line of the script, so you have to take that out. It's still a ton of work, but even for writing and concepting, it can save so much time, and it opens up new things that just wouldn't be able to exist otherwise. So even right now, with how kind of finicky and clunky these tools can be, they're still super useful. They can still save you a lot of time, but they still require so much extra knowledge and technique and creativity to actually be useful for professional work. Now, in the future, I do suspect that generative video tools like Runway and Sora are actually going to become useful for motion designers. Runway recently put out a video where they showed a VFX workflow using their video generator tool. And it's essentially feeding it in a still image from a video that you've shot and having it generate based on that image, and then basically using the result, masking it out and compositing it in to the original footage. It's kind of a neat way to quickly get some pretty complex looking effects. I actually tried this in a recent Motion Mondays video, and it didn't go well. These tools are just not really there yet. But in the future, having the ability to generate, say, smoke or fire or something that looks very realistic without having to run simulations or go find the perfect VFX asset, that does seem like it could save a lot of time. You're still going to need to know a whole bunch of other things in order to make that useful. So you're still going to need the artist, and you're still going to need someone with the idea to prompt the thing in the first place. I keep waiting for some really, really good AI video filters to come out, and there are some out there, but the coherence tends to be not that great yet. They don't really work perfectly, but I could see that being another really useful thing. There's a very cool tool called Fable, which is a cloud-based 2D animation app. It works a lot like After Effects, but it has this feature where you can animate a bunch of simple shapes like, we tend to do as motion designers, and then you can run that output through an AI filter that can make it look like claymation or a bunch of other styles. That is very cool because then you're combining something that you built and has all of the nuance that currently only humans can do and only really good animators can pull off. But you can achieve looks that would be so much harder to do if you had to manually create those looks. And eventually, maybe you'll be able to animate some really simple shapes and then feed the model a style frame that you created, and maybe it can apply the style to your animation. I don't really know if that's possible, but if something like that is possible, that seems like a very, very useful thing for motion design. That could speed up a lot of tasks. If you're an After Effects artist, you know that when you're doing high-end work, a lot of the work that you're doing isn't animation. It's figuring out how to parent this texture to this thing and mask it just the right way and keyframe it because it looks weird when it's on this side of the screen. And there's a lot of that finicky stuff that you just have to do to get the best results. And maybe there's a world where AI helps with that stuff, and that would be amazing. So to me, that kind of sums up my thoughts on the current state of these tools, how useful they are, and what I hope to see from them in the future. Now let's start talking about the future of all of this. And this is where I'm really just going to be speculating. So the first thing I want to talk about is how good can these tools actually get? I've said this before on this channel, but when you're doing professional work, there's a bar you have to clear, right? If you think about the quality of your work going from 0 to 100%, right? You most of the time don't need to get it to 100% for your client to be happy, but you probably needed to get it to 95%, maybe 90% for some clients that don't really have taste, but 70% isn't going to cut it. It's not good enough. And to me, that's where these tools are right now. If you're doing anything with movement to it, these tools are maybe at best 70 to 75% good enough. And they always require a ton of cleanup afterwards. And so I think for now, the tools, especially the video generative tools, they're not useless. There are uses for them, but they're pretty close to useless for professional work at this point. But of course, they're going to get better. What's the saying? These are the worst these tools are ever going to be. Okay, you're probably right about that. However, there is an interesting kind of conversation going on in the world of AI right now about the AI plateau. So what's the AI plateau? Okay. So this gets a little technical, but you have to understand how these models actually work. And I think large language models are a little bit easier to understand than the diffusion models that, Midjourney and Runway are based on. So ChatGPT, the way it works is it scrapes the entire internet, all of Reddit, all of Stack Overflow. If MoGraph.net was still around, it would have scraped that too. It definitely has scraped School Motion. And it doesn't store that information inside of a database anywhere. There's no copy of all of the posts from Reddit at OpenAI somewhere. That's not how it works. What it does is it ingests all of that material and it starts looking for patterns. I'm grossly oversimplifying it, but that's essentially what it does. It starts looking for patterns and it iterates and iterates and iterates billions, trillions of times. And every time what it's trying to do is to build a predictive model so that you can feed it text and it can predict what will come next. That is literally what a large language model is. It predicts what comes next. The thing is, it's so good at it, it's so obscenely good at it, that it has the appearance of having this memory of all of the things that it was trained on. And so because of that, there is this issue that ChatGPT can build a model that has so much training data, it can almost appear like it just knows everything that was on the internet. And the problem comes in when you want it to be able to speak intelligently about things it wasn't trained on. That would be general intelligence. And there have been AI researchers that have come out and said, look, if you trained a large language model perfectly, what it would be able to do is perfectly recall the data it was trained on without actually storing the data. It's almost like compressing all of that data into this insanely complex algorithm that can spit the data back out. But the implication of that is that for the model to get better and more intelligent and hallucinate less, the best way to do that is to train it on more data. And it's got to be high quality data. If you're training it on 4chan or something like that, you're not going to get the same results. And there's similar issues with Midjourney, and the only way that those models can get better is with more training on more data. And when you've already scraped all of the internet, Runway recently, it was alleged, scraped all of YouTube and Netflix. And there's only so many sources of video and imagery out there that's going to be useful for AI training. So it's actually not clear that you can just keep scaling up the training data forever to get better and better results. That's what some people think, but it's very expensive to do that. It costs more to train the more data you have. And it's not clear that we're not sort of seeing a plateau, right? One of the things that a lot of people assumed when these tools really started to take off, especially when ChatGPT 4 came out, because it was so much better than ChatGPT 3, they assumed that what we were seeing was the beginning of a vertical takeoff in the capability of these models. But a lot of people who have studied technology and are sort of historians of this stuff, they say, well, usually what you see is you see a slow start. AI has actually been around for a lot longer than most people realize, but it wasn't useful enough. It wasn't good enough. And then all of a sudden it hit some kind of critical mass and whoosh, took off like that. And then what almost always happens is it gets to a certain point and you reach the point of diminishing returns, where more data, more training, more compute is going to only get you marginally better models than what you currently have. And to get to the quantum leap that's going to be necessary to take us from, the 75% good enough mark to the 98% good enough mark, it's not totally clear that we have the capability of doing that with the current architecture of these models. Now, there's a lot of brilliant people way smarter than me that are trying to figure this out. There's talk of using synthetic training data, meaning data that was actually created by the AI to then train itself. And there's questions about whether that works well or not. There's other techniques and technologies that you can kind of layer on top of these models to make them work better. But a lot of people are worried that we are actually hitting a pretty hard brick wall, and the models that we're going to see coming out in the next 2 and 3 years, they will be better than what we have now. But will they be that much better? Or are we now talking about slow incremental growth? And that may be the case. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that's actually kind of what I predict. I predict that we will continue to see crazy examples of things that we can't believe are possible. AI influencers that are almost indistinguishable from real people. And when you watch the video with no sound, it could fool you. But then as soon as you turn the sound on and you see the lip sync doesn't quite match up, and even when it does look okay, sometimes there's more teeth on one side of the mouth, and when the hand turns, it looks a little weird. Again, these tools are 75, maybe some of them are 80, 85% of the way there. But how do they get to 95% of the way? I'm not confident that they can get there in a short amount of time. I think it is going to take probably another breakthrough to get them there, or at the very least, it's just going to be assumed that you're going to take the output from these tools and you're going to have to do a lot of manipulation to them after the fact, using the tools that we already know, using compositing, using animation, using paint and roto to actually get the result you're after. If you have a human being on screen, you need to be able to direct them very, very, very precisely. And currently you just can't. It's just not possible. And if you try to imagine what it would take to actually make that possible, it's a breakthrough. It's like a whole new technology almost to get to that point. So my prediction is that in the short term, these tools are going to continue to get better and more useful, and hopefully faster too, because a lot of them are still kind of slow and clunky to use. You type in a prompt and then you have to wait a couple minutes to see anything, and then it's not right and you got to reprompt it. But I think that the rate of change is going to slow. I don't think we're going to see anything like we saw 18 months ago where almost every week there was some new crazy thing coming out. I think those days are behind us, at least for a while, until there's some new breakthrough. I think the hallucination problem is going to persist. It's gotten a lot better. If you remember earlier versions of Midjourney, they could not deal with human hands. Eyes tended to look weird, and that is mostly solved, but not entirely solved. Let's say it's 75 or 80% solved, which again, is not good enough for a lot of professional work. And the big problem with the fact that these models hallucinate, even ChatGPT, it makes up facts sometimes. The problem is you can't just trust it. If I create an animation in After Effects and I import all the layers and I set the keyframes and I add the effects, and then I hit render, I have 100% trust that the render is going to look like what I made. It's going to be my intent turned into a render. But by their nature, AI tools don't work that way. And so what that means is every single professional use case for this has to have some human intervention. You have to at least double check what it's given you. And sometimes what it's given you is perfectly fine. But even if 1 out of 100 times it's not, you can't trust it. That's the difference between being 75% good enough, 95% good enough, and 100% good enough. And to get to that 100% mark where you can prompt something and be pretty confident that you're going to get what you actually wanted and intended, that may be 50 years from now. Who knows? And so because of that, I think even for the most basic of use cases, you're going to have a human artist involved for anything above the level of a Craigslist ad. So that's the short term. Let's call it the next 24 to 36 months. Now, what about after that? Well, this is where we get into naked speculation. And I think that there are some possible solutions to the AI bubble that may emerge. So one really interesting thing is that AI has now been open source to a large extent. Models like ChatGPT and Midjourney and DALL-E, these are closed source, so you can't just use their model without paying. However, interestingly, Meta has created its own model called Llama. The most recent version of it came out recently, and a lot of people doing AI benchmarks have said it's almost as good as ChatGPT 4. And what's cool is it's open source. Now, Meta isn't doing this out of the goodness of their heart. They're doing it so that the open source community can help make the model better for free, essentially. And then Meta will be able to use that model internally at Facebook and Instagram and its other companies. And also, it is sort of a defensive play against companies like OpenAI and Anthropic, who, by their business model, have to charge for these models. If Meta can just give it away and it's almost as good, it might put those companies out of business. But the other cool thing about open source models is that you can run them locally on your computer. If that's the case, you don't have to pay a monthly fee to use AI, and people are already doing this. And I think it's going to take maybe another generation of hardware for this to work well enough for it to really be adopted. But for example, right now, if you go into Photoshop and you use generative fill, you have to be connected to the internet because the Firefly model that is being run is being hosted by Adobe on their servers, and then the result is downloaded back to your machine. But imagine when computers and GPUs and chips are fast enough and the models are refined enough where you don't need that. And you've got AI models that can run locally on your phone, which again, already exists. It's just most people aren't doing that yet. But once that becomes possible, I think the cost is going to drop drastically for artists. Now, for the companies training the models, the cost doesn't drop. But if there's open source models like Llama, maybe those companies don't need to exist, or at least not in the same way they do now. I also think in the long term, the differentiator between these tools is not going to be the quality of the tool as much. I think eventually all of the best ones will reach some sort of parity. And so what that means is the way they're going to compete is going to be with their UI and any capabilities that they augment with. And so I think a good example of this is Flux. Flux is a relatively new open source model that's competing with Midjourney, and it can give you almost as good results, in some cases better. But the difference is it's open source. And so what this means is you can use it on a tool like Hugging Face, which is just a website that lets you load up and use different AI models, which is pretty cool. But while as of this recording, Midjourney is still using Discord as its primary interface, which is horrible, Flux actually has a web-based interface that's way better, way nicer to use. And if you haven't used Adobe's Firefly generator, that has what I think is probably one of the best UIs. It's just so easy to play around and kind of get a better sense of what result you're going to get based on the settings. So I think that we're going to see more of that. We're going to see more well-designed user experiences around these tools, and it's going to make them easier for more artists to adopt. To do a lot of tasks right now, like more advanced tasks in AI, you have to use tools like Comfy UI, which is really, really technical. It's like a node-based editor for AI models. It's almost like using Nuke. And I think companies like Adobe are just going to continue to add different AI features and AI tools into their existing apps. And hopefully the performance and the quality of what you get from those will continue to improve. But I do think eventually a lot of this stuff will happen locally on your machine, which will bring the cost way down and hopefully make them more responsive too and more secure. And so if we project out and you imagine that future, what does it look like for a motion designer trying to make a living in this industry? Well, here is where I would really love your take. So please leave a comment after you're done with this. Here's my take though. I think that there is no future where these tools are not being used by most artists. I think the landscape is going to look very different, especially if you try to project out 10 years. I think it's quite possible that some of the large companies that exist now won't exist anymore, or there will be new ones that pop up and overtake them. But in the end, these tools are here. They are very useful. They're hopefully going to get useful enough to actually get to that 95% mark at some point. That's going to open up a lot of opportunities. But even if that takes 30 or 40 years, in the meantime, I think that we're going to be in a world where artists who use these tools can iterate much faster and can actually more precisely address their clients' needs than artists who don't. Now, I said I'm not going deep into the ethics of these tools. That's, in my opinion, a totally different conversation. But I know that there are still artists who don't want to touch these tools. They feel very strongly about it, and I totally respect that. But as a practical matter, leaving the ethics part out of it, I think that it's going to be harder and harder to compete with other artists if you're not using tools that can make you faster and more effective. If you can imagine some beautiful explainer video from ordinary folk, which, at this point, everything's handmade and they're hiring amazing designers and they have amazing animators there and they're creating these beautiful things. And I remember when we hired them to do our manifesto video, that took months to pull off. That was a ton of work. But if there was a way to achieve the same result, and it's got to be, remember, you got to hit that 95% mark, so we're not there yet. But if there was a way to get that result, but instead of taking months, they could do it in 3 weeks or something like that, wouldn't that be worth doing if you're a studio? And that doesn't mean you have to charge less either. It means you can do more, you can iterate more. It might just mean you're going to spend the exact same amount of time on the project. It's just going to come out even better because the speed of iteration and experimentation has been increased. And if you look at the history of technological advancement in post-production, that's basically been the story. The faster computers get, the better software gets. When GPU rendering came out, it didn't all of a sudden take less time to do a client project. It just meant the end result was going to come out better because instead of waiting for renders, you could spend that time fiddling with the lighting or the texturing or the animation. We talk about Unreal Engine a lot on this channel, and the real-time 3D revolution isn't necessarily about being able to do your client's projects faster. It's about being able to spend less time doing the stuff you don't want to be doing, like waiting on renders. And with AI, my hope is that there'd be an analog to this where it's doing things for you that you don't necessarily as an artist want to spend a lot of time doing, like scouring through stock imagery websites, looking for the perfect thing when you have in your head what you want. And now there's a tool that can get you currently 75% of the way there, and then using the rest of your skills, you can bring it to 100%. And maybe one day those tools are good enough to give you exactly what you want, and then you have it. You can start working and animating and modeling and doing all the things you want to do, and you're not waiting around. If you're a 3D artist and you have some hero model and you want a bunch of little sort of visual elements in the background, well, you could model all of those. You could go try to find some 3D stock pack that would give you that. Maybe there's a tool in the near future that can actually just spit out things that are good enough for that use case, and you just saved yourself hours looking for or creating those things yourself. I think on the visual effects front, there's going to be a lot of potential applications. One of the things that my business partner used to do at my studio up in Boston was, and you may not even believe this if you're younger, but one of the things that was actually pretty lucrative was taking footage of sandwiches that were shot on these food footage shoots by this major sandwich chain, and they would need to have steam coming off of them because some of these sandwiches were hot, right? And so we would actually have to composite steam onto the footage. And there was more to it than you might imagine. The footage was moving, so we actually had to do a camera track, and there was a little bit of roto because, the steam sometimes would have to go behind another sandwich. And so there was actual work involved. But it seems to me like these tools may actually be able to just do that kind of stuff in the future. And while that stuff paid the bills, that wasn't really why any of us got into post-production, to add steam to sandwiches or to cups of coffee sitting on the shelf at the end of a Keurig ad. I think a lot of that stuff could be done at the very least faster with more creative ability involved. We would actually shoot corn on the cob steaming against a black background, and that's how we would get the steam plates that we would composite over. But what if these tools could actually generate any shape of steam or steam that resolves to the shape of your client's logo? These are things that would be pretty difficult to do. I mean, you could certainly do them now using tools like Houdini or even Cinema 4D, but it'd be much harder to do. And it's just an asset that you need to composite in. Maybe these tools can give that to you. No matter what the case ends up being, I don't see a world where these tools are doing anything for you. I see them generating assets based on your ideas, and then you're still gonna have to do work to make it look the way you want. In the end, as a professional artist, what you're doing is translating your client's words into an image in your brain and into pixels on a screen. And my opinion is anything that can help you do that faster, more effectively, and with less pain, less tedium, that's a win. And so I hope I'm right, I think that's where AI is going. So to wrap this up, I don't really feel like giving advice is the right thing to do right now because, like I said, I'm speculating. I could be totally wrong about this stuff. I've already been wrong about some things with AI. The capabilities are way further along now than I thought they'd be, but there is definitely a slowdown, and everyone's talking about that. But one thing I will say is that to those of you that are watching that have very serious ethical concerns about using tools like this because of the way they're trained, I think that's an extremely valid point. And I really respect people who stick to their principles like that. And if you don't want to use these tools, if you think they're unethical, I stand with you. However, as a pragmatist, just someone being realistic and kind of looking around the industry and reading the room, I'm telling you that more and more artists, more and more studios are becoming comfortable using these. They're recognizing that they don't solve all your problems. You still are gonna have to do a ton of work, and you're gonna need to know the creative and software skills to be able to do it. And even using these AI tools takes some training. You're not as good at using them initially. You have to learn how they work and learn their idiosyncrasies. But when you learn that and you combine those with the skills you have, you are able to work faster. You are able to execute things that in some cases, there's really no other way to do. Not because it's not possible, but because the budget wouldn't be there to justify the amount of work it would take to get that result. Now, you can get that result with a ton of work, but with some help from our robot overlords. I guess I'm saying I don't think AI is going to replace human artists. I think it's going to augment human artists the same way every other technological innovation in our industry has done over the past probably 100 years. And there's going to be speed bumps, and there's going to be crazy new things that come out and blow all of our minds, and I'll be eating my words. And I guarantee at least some of the words I've said in this video, I will eat, and I'll eat them publicly. It's fine. But from where I sit right now, I'm not scared of AI. I'm comfortable using it. And I think that even now, when it's not quite good enough to get you all the way there, it's definitely useful. So that's it. Those are my thoughts. And hopefully this gave you some interesting things to roll around in your brain. What I would love is for you to leave a comment. Let me know what you think. Let's keep this conversation going. This is a conversation that we're going to be having for the next several years at a minimum, probably for longer than that. But it's always fun to think about this stuff and to talk about it. And so I hope you got some value out of listening to me ramble. Thank you so much for watching or listening. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any of our podcasts. We have some amazing guests coming up, and I will catch you on the next one.